France 24 debate after the opening of the Bradley Manning court-martial trial. That U.S. private, 25 years old, accused of leaking hundreds of thousands of classified cables to the whistleblowing site WikiLeaks. We're talking about it and its consequences from Washington, Mark Jacobson, who is with the Truman Fellowship and also with the Council on Foreign Relations, a former civilian staff member for NATO. In New York, Chase Madar, attorney and author of The Passion of Bradley Manning, the story behind the WikiLeaks whistleblower, with us here in the studio. Former U.S. diplomat William Jordan and political scientist Aurélien Colson of the French business school ESSEC. On Twitter, Oregon Michael says that Manning's superiors' refusal to address his concerns impelled him into a betrayal of confidence. His conscientious objection is heroic. That's one reaction we've gotten. Now, we were talking about him a little bit in part one. Among Bradley Manning's, I guess you could call the most high-profile advocates, Daniel Ellsberg, who faced the same charges after leaking the Pentagon Papers in 1971. It was a damning chronicle of the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam, a leak, a major one, that helped sway public opinion against the Vietnam War. Here's what Ellsberg had to say today.
President Obama's promise for transparency in government is worth as much as his promise to close Guantanamo, which is zero, worthless. He's actually conducting the most secretive administration in history that anyone can remember. More prosecutions for leaks, twice as many as all previous presidents put together.
Mark Jacobson, in part one of our discussion, you were saying you were disappointed that Daniel Ellsberg was defending Bradley Manning, that their two cases are very different. But what do you say to critics who say that there is a penchant for zeal on the part of the current U.S. president?
Well, let me make 2 points on that. First, if you're a conscientious objector, you have numerous outlets besides going straight to the media to raise your objections, and Manning took none of those. I think you could argue that in Ellsberg's case, he did raise some things internally, but to the transparency and secrecy issue with the current administration, I think what people forget is we are still at war. Now, the president made a very clear statement that we do not want to be in a state of perpetual war, but we have been at a state of war since September 11, 2001, and that means there are many more secrets to protect. This has to do with weapon systems. We've seen the debate over drones, for example, but that doesn't mean there's not transparency or oversight, and I'm always most concerned about oversight. I think that you could always argue that Congress could provide a bit more, but I don't think the media has been slacking in terms of their investigative journalism through the past 10 years as well. And so I do feel comfortable with this balance between secrecy and transparency, and think the administration has frankly erred on the side of transparency in most cases.
Chase Madar, fair point. You have to perhaps make things a little bit more airtight when you've been at war for a decade, and also in an era where all it takes is the click of a mouse to send through hundreds of thousands of documents.
Well, I disagree entirely. The decision to go to war and the decision to stay to war, these are public decisions, and they should be well-informed decisions. One of the reasons we have been at war without any strategic gain or security gain is because we've been making poorly informed decisions. The government has starved the public discourse of meaningful information. This is a very large part of what led us into the military and humanitarian disaster in Iraq and kept us escalating in Afghanistan. If we're ever going to get out of this permanent state of war, it's going to take more than pretty speeches by President Obama. We're going to need to know the facts. And just to give you a little perspective, what Bradley Manning leaked is less than 1% of what Washington classifies in any given year. That was 92 million documents at last count in 2011, up from 77 million the year before. Now, when it comes to leaks versus secrecy, there is a real threat to national security, and that is the dystopian extreme degree of secrecy that we have in Washington. Now, everyone agrees that there are legitimate secrets. I'm sure Julian Assange would say that even after 4 whiskeys. But we don't need to classify 92 million documents a year. There's no surprise that our foreign policy has been such a flaming wreck with so much secrecy.
All right, William Jordan, is it true that sometimes you guys tend to classify stuff that maybe doesn't need to be classified?
Sure, absolutely. And I can tell you, as somebody who was in the hot seat having to make the decision as to how something was classified, I always opted to lower the classification as much as possible. No question about it.
Aurélien Colson, how do you sift through all this information? We know that the first batch of WikiLeaks went out raw, that the second batch was more filtered. There was a program done with several major newspapers, including...
Correct. You know, we have to put this into a sort of historical perspective because, you know, we live in democracies. This is just great. And historically, democratization of society goes along with the limitation of secrecy. That is demonstrated. It's true also for the United States, with the exception of the Bush administration, which clearly changed this sort of trend. Now, what is the problem here? Democracy is based on transparency, but a number of democratic policies or processes must be protected by secrecy. Okay, simply when the police want to attack some sort of mafia, they're not going to put this on the newspaper the day before. So the question here is, how can we organize processes through which the resort to secrecy will be accepted from a democratic viewpoint? Either you can do this before, ex ante, there must be some sort of public debate explaining why a certain course of action has to be protected by secrecy. If this is not possible, then you must have some sort of process ex post, and that is the key word of accountability. Okay, maybe we had to do this in some sort of covert manner. Now, let us explain the reasons why. And probably this is lacking at the moment.
All right, we're talking about the reasons why Chase Madar was complaining about Barack Obama's, what did you say, pretty speeches that he's made. We can hear what he had to say, for instance, on the subject of drones. Their numbers have increased dramatically under Obama's watch. One ex-Bush administration NATO ambassador complaining it makes Washington look like it has a permanent kill list. Obama, for his part, insists that there is accountability and that it is all above board.
After I took office, my administration began briefing all strikes outside of Iraq and Afghanistan to the appropriate committees of Congress. Let me repeat that. Not only did Congress authorize the use of force, it is briefed on every strike that America takes.
William Jordan, is Congress briefed about every strike that America takes? And is it briefed beforehand?
I doubt it's briefed beforehand, but I believe it's briefed after every strike is made. There are special intelligence committees and members of the House Armed Services committees that get briefed on a regular basis about this stuff. Yeah, I think it's happening.
Chase Madar?
Look, I think the whole drone strike program is strategically foolish. It generates more security liabilities than it solves. And I don't think that transparency, which is kind of a secondary issue, this has been adequately addressed either. The Obama administration has been leaking with impunity, including Brennan himself about this, but elite leaks are not punished. Elite leaks are how we read our news. You can't go a week without reading in the New York Times or the Washington Post some unnamed, highly placed official leaking secret documents. And that's just the norm. And it should not be punished either. That's how we found out about Watergate. That's how we know anything about our drone strike program.
All right. I got to say, a lot of the tweets we've been receiving have been siding with Chase Madar. Bradley Manning is a great whistleblower who courageously exposed the truth to the blinded world, says Mustafa 1920. Mark Jacobson, on this issue of accountability, do you think that the U.S. president is keeping everyone informed enough?
Well, Chase has made some good points on policy issues, so I'm not going to disagree with him on the fallacy of things like the invasion of Iraq. But I do have to take issue with this notion that there isn't enough accountability. And yes, congressional committees are briefed before strikes take place. Congressional committees are briefed regularly on actions that are taken by the Central Intelligence Agency. They are briefed regularly on actions that are taken by the Department of Defense. And Congress sets the laws that the executive branch lives by. I do understand that there are some who believe that the only sufficient transparency are the front pages of papers and the web postings on the internet. But we are a democracy, as I think all four of us have agreed. And that means that we have legislative oversight of executive branch programs, and this is how we ensure that there is a balance of power and that infractions are dealt with in the appropriate manners. And this does not always mean a trial. This doesn't mean that everybody who leaks has to go on trial. And again, to bring this back to Manning, there are other people who have leaked and have been prosecuted, and there are other people who've leaked who've lost their security clearances or mishandled information and lost their clearances. So I think we sometimes paint this with too broad a brush.
So what's the just punishment in your view for Bradley Manning?
Well, I think Bradley Manning should spend a long time in prison. Now, I am making that statement based on the fact that he has already tried to cut a deal on some of these and admitted his guilt. But I actually think that part of his punishment should be to speak to people, whether it's journalists, members of Congress, their staff of the executive branch, on what really motivated him to do this. If it was truly an issue of conscience, then there are going to be others who take issue with policy. But as I said before, there's a right way to address that and a wrong way to address it. Frankly, if Manning had publicly resigned in a very ostentatious way, he would have attracted as much attention to these issues, including deaths of civilians that may or may not have been disclosed appropriately beforehand. As I said, there are many ways to do that. We've seen State Department officials resign publicly in the past, and there's nothing that says that a private can't make the same statement if he or she resigns.
In this case, though, you were saying, Aurélien Cosson, that he wasn't getting much name recognition from established media when he first tried to go public.
Apparently, he was not taken seriously by the Washington Post. But you see here, I mean, the overall question goes wider than that. The overall question is, can democracies protect themselves while remaining democracies, fully fledged democracies? That is the overall question. And to that question, the answer must be yes. It must be yes. I mean, there's no other choice. So the question is, how can you pretend to defend your value while obviously not respecting them? Here we've got lots of legal discussions about, how the process is going on, and at the same time, Guantanamo is a total loophole, legally speaking, total loophole. So here, there's a lack of coherence. And back to that question, we must make the demonstration that democracies can protect themselves while remaining democracies. Otherwise, that will be the defeat.
All right, speaking of whether or not the rules have been bent when it comes to democracy, there's what's happened to the Associated Press news agency, discovering that the Justice Department tapped the phones of its reporters to find out who'd been leaking information about a foiled terror plot.
They haven't told us what they're looking for, and nor have they explained why we got no prior notice, which our lawyers tell us is not only customary but required.
William Jordan, again, this fueling the perception that there is a certain amount of zeal these days inside the Obama administration.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, I want to use this opportunity to return to some of the points particularly made in New York about a lot of this. I actually think that the Obama administration is maladroit and wrong in terms of the way it has been approaching the leaks. I think it is completely not commensurate with the actual threat posed by a lot of the leakers. I think that it's a carryover from the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, and the whole post-9/11 syndrome in the United States, the national security state being ramped up to an nth degree. To me, getting back to just very briefly the Bradley Manning case, I tend to distinguish between what I consider to be legitimate aspects of whistleblowing in terms of the video, for example, that he leaked, and the massive dump of raw cables. In that respect, what Bradley Manning did versus what Daniel Ellsberg did is almost like a night and day contrast. The Obama administration has gotten itself now wrapped up in a rather contradictory and self-defeating policy of going after leakers, which is causing everything to focus on that as opposed to some of the other contradictions, such as Guantanamo, such as the whole nature of internal spying and security in this time when, as has already been mentioned, we are still in a state of war, at least in Afghanistan. We are still facing terrorist threats.
Going after leakers, Mark Jacobson, has the Obama administration abused its use of an espionage act that was instilled for World War I?
Well, I'll leave that for a lawyer, but I don't think that that they've abused this. I think there's some confusion, and I also think there's some legitimate concern or feelings of discomfort with the AP situation. I concede that. But just because a law is old doesn't mean that it's not a good law. And I think, though, that it would be very wise of Congress to perhaps hold hearings to take a look at the 1917 Espionage Act. And frankly, there's some other acts that the Bush administration played around with that I could see people have discomfort with as well. But maybe it is a time to revisit that. And that's another wonderful thing about democracy. You can have these discussions about what should be secret and why in open hearings to some degree. And I think that maybe it is time for Congress to take a look and make sure that the laws that govern secrecy are applicable in a world where, as you said before, secrets can be shared irrelevant of who's supposed to have access with the click of a mouse.
All right. One other comment from Twitter. The argument isn't about releasing those documents, but why the military, the government, doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. Chase Madar, do you feel as though now there's going to be a healthy discussion and that some of the rules are going to change?
Well, I have an answer for this interesting tweet. The reason why Washington does not deserve always the benefit of the doubt is that its past dozen years of foreign policy have been just disaster after disaster. I know I'm repeating myself, but this context is absolutely necessary. To look at the thousands of American soldiers who have died in Afghanistan under Obama's presidency, and to blame that on WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning is simply absurd. I don't know why our foreign policy elites are focusing in on these things that have done damage that is indetectable, but have provided a great benefit both to the world and above all to the United States. Actually, I do know the answer. It's embarrassing to them. And frankly, if I had led the United States into Iraq and then kept us there in Afghanistan, I think that embarrassment is richly deserved.
All right. Chase Madar, let me just get a response on that, Aurélien Colson, and maybe also a question for the Frenchman on the set here. Here we, in France, what's classified or not has not really come up for discussion. We know, for instance, there's a big scandal about frigates sold to Taiwan, and it's got classified defense, and it's hard to go into these things years on.
Well, that is correct, but there was once again, the movement is less and less secrecy or more and more controlled secrecy. And just to give an example, in 1998, Prime Minister Jospin had a new piece of legislation voted in Parliament to better control the capacity for senior officials to pretend that this should be protected by secret défense. Okay, so this is under bigger control. But the one thing I wanted to say here is that in all this debate, you have, big words such as, realpolitik, reason of state, raison d'etat. Now, my question is, where are the realists? Where are the truly realist people? Because I think that the truly realist are the people who take the pain to understand how the world functions and understand that things like Guantanamo or carpet bombing or Abu Ghraib are self-defeating. They're self-defeating. This is not how you're going to support security and our values.
All right, priming the pump for another discussion. I want to thank you, Aurélien Colson and William Jordan. I want to thank Mark Jacobson in Washington and as well Chase Madar in New York City for being with us. Stick around because we're going to continue the discussion for just a moment with James Creedon, our Media Buzz editor.
Evening, François.
How are you?
Good.
Now, I noticed that this story about Bradley Manning, you were saying yesterday, getting second billing behind the Turkey story, obviously, but it's still getting a lot of billing, and there's a lot of star power behind Bradley Manning, it seems.
Absolutely, François. You've got a couple of people who, with a certain degree of notoriety, tweeting on the issue. Russell Brand, for example. Bradley Manning is on trial, he says. He has sacrificed himself for our good. Support him. And I have to say, looking across social media, looking on Twitter, etc., you do see more people who seem to have a degree of sympathy with him than who are critical of him. I guess that is something to do too with the demographics on social media. Younger people, perhaps a bit more anti-establishment people, as we've seen in Turkey as well recently. So to give you a sense of what is being linked to I Am Bradley Manning, 1,112 days of unjust confinement is enough. These sort of websites linking also to petitions. One petition, would you believe, François, to give him the Nobel Peace Prize that's been signed by about 50,000 people. So that's giving you a sense of some of the more positive, supportive elements on social media. Elsewhere, Julian Assange has also weighed in. He gave an interview to the Huffington Post saying, well, you can read the headline there, media's failure to defend Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks emboldened the Department of Justice. So he's critical of the media, but he tends to do that. A quote from him, as soon as organisations or people stop demanding that their rights be protected, then they are overrun and the current situation results. So he is saying the media wasn't strong enough in its defence of Bradley Manning. Now, I guess you probably want to see some of those comments as well. That lots of people saying basically the United States should be in the dock, not Bradley Manning, that it's what would you say, secrecy and injustice that are on trial. But you do have some supportive voices as well for the US Justice, the Department of Justice rather. One such voice is Tim Stanley, writing for The Telegraph. Bradley Manning is a traitor, a whistleblower and a victim of Obama's bullying. And a terrible gay icon, he points out there too. Bizarrely, he was meant to feature prominently in the San Francisco Gay Pride, but actually even that became a political football and he was removed.
He was pulled from that.
He was.
All right, what are some of the other stories you'll be following for us later with Laura Baines?
All right, well, some of the stories we'll be looking at is one which is particularly odd, François. Take a look at this headline. It's in French, but we will, of course, translate a Vélib. Now, the Paris mayoral race is sort of kicking off ahead of time today with two female candidates. And the Vélib is one of these big political issues in Paris.
You can go and rent them.
That's right. You can take them out of the dock and cycle around, and it's wonderful. One of them has been found in Bamako, of all places, right? Now, the whole principle of these bikes, as you know, is you have to dock them in once you've used them, and you have maybe a 30-minute limit. So how he managed to cycle from Paris to Bamako in 30 minutes, I don't know. But
Aurélien Courson, is that going to sway your vote against the outgoing socialists?
I will not comment on that, no.
You won't comment, okay.
It was suspected when this bike scheme was brought in a few years back that some bikes had been stolen and that there were perhaps cargo planes going to Africa because of the robust nature of these bikes. They sort of look like 4x4s or whatever.
But
that was speculation.
You've got to give your credit card. Someone must have a hefty credit card bill because actually, if you don't bring it back...
We have a photo of the guy who has this bike in Bamako. There he is.
Okay.
And let's just say he probably owes more than he can afford at this stage because that's a bill that's
meter's
mounting
running.
up. The meter's running somewhere in Paris.
All right, finally?
And well, I mean, that's the main story. You also have a couple of Twitter spat between Brian McFadden, François. He is a notorious singer, as you know yourself, and he...
Notorious?
Well, I think so. In any case, he's tweeting about Ryanair, right? He's saying that in summertime, the full low fares airline brings in excess baggage charges, right? So generally speaking, if you're caught pretty heavily, if you're a kilo over or 2 kilos over,
They
but in
thought at one point
summertime,
about charging to go to the
bathroom,
but
right?
bathroom, but they've scrapped that concept.
That's right.
For
so
now.
In any case, Brian McFadden, who could probably afford the €150 of extra charges, decided to tweet his discontent and calling him a scumbag, no less. That's Michael O'Leary.
That's very rude.
It is very rude, saying that hardworking people are being tricked by these loopholes, which are hidden loopholes, and you were stealing your own people's money. Now, it actually led to a big amount of discussion on social media regarding that, as people, I suppose, are preparing to head off on their summer holidays. That mightn't be a bad thing. It could alert them to these hidden charges.
And you got to wonder with Ryanair, because is it, the old saying by Oscar Wilde, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about, because here we are talking about Ryanair.
Well, it's not necessarily that positive, but Michael O'Leary, I think, is one man who thinks that all publicity is good publicity. So there you go.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, James Creedon. I know you'll
Thanks,
be back
François.
later with Laura Baines.
That's right, 9:15 p.m.
All right, I want to thank you. Thank you for being with us here with the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Laura will have all the news for you right at the top of the hour.